Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. For those of you who don't know, my name is Dan Kovatz. I am the Executive Director of the Illinois Democratic County Chairs Association. Tonight, along with our continued partnership with the Democratic Party of Illinois, we are going to be doing our virtual training on township caucuses and your role as township chairs or county chairs with those caucuses. So before we get going with that, I want to go over a couple of ground rules for tonight's training. We have a lot of different experience on tonight's call. I know we had close to 70 people sign up for tonight's training. We've got a good group that's already joined so far. So a couple of things I want to point out: be respectful of each other. If you notice, everyone's been muted as you join the call. Everyone's going to continue to be muted throughout the call tonight. And if you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat and our two presenters will answer them as we're going along. Be present. So tonight's session is going to take about an hour, depending on questions and how engaged everyone is. So as we're here, put your phone to the side. Don't worry about that email. We'll make sure we'll get you can get back to it when we finish up. We have a lot of focus on the November general election, and that's vitally important to a lot of things. But we have these township caucuses coming up almost a month after the election. So we want to make sure that we are prepared as a party for those township caucuses. So it's important that we're present during this training and taking notes and making sure that we keep up on this. We are recording tonight's session that will be shared with the Democratic Party of Illinois as part of our ongoing virtual training series. So if you missed something, don't worry about it. We will be able to share the recording of this later along with the training deck. So don't worry about that information there. Last thing for ground rules, my mom always told me you're never going to learn unless you ask questions. So tonight we have two, I think they're experts, two friends of mine that are very skilled when it comes to township caucuses. So please ask away. This is what we're here for. We're here to learn, especially if we are in a county that does not do a lot of township caucuses. This is where we need to be asking questions. So make sure you put your questions in the chat and we will get to them throughout the session tonight. So what would be a virtual training if we didn't start out with a quick little icebreaker? We've got a good group on, so please, everyone, let's kind of check in. Where are you coming to us from today? Are you a county chair, township chair, just a PC, looking to learn? Put your answers in the chat. Let's see where everyone's at tonight. So while you're doing that, I'm going to introduce our two presenters for tonight. So let me go ahead and add them both here. Our first presenter is Tony Shearing. Tony is an associate at Brown Hay and Stevens law firm based in Springfield. He is also the general counsel for the County Chairs Association and has been doing township presentations for last couple of years. And we also have County Chair Brian Smith from Macon County, who is the former executive director of the Township Officials of Illinois. So we have two very skilled individuals when it comes to township caucuses and interacting with the Democratic Party. Ready for tonight's presentation. And Tony, I will kick it over to you.
Thanks so much, Dan. Good evening, everybody. Happy to be with you and look forward to the conversation that we have. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. We do have a slide deck that we're going to be operating off of for the remainder of the night until we get to questions and answers. And I will work with Dan to make sure that this is available for all of you as part of the recording that gets forwarded to DPI. So again, as Dan said, we're going to focus on the caucus process and kind of what the timeline is, what some of the documents are, and just kind of different things that you need to remember. I will do my best to point out if there are specific things I think you need to remember or things that are really important. I'll do my best to flag those. and Chair Smith, Brian, will also as well. So we're going to kind of tag team this. I'm going to do a fair amount of the talking, but Chair Smith is going to jump in frequently as well to answer questions or pointers based on his experience as the former executive director of the Township Officials of Illinois. So, all right, this is my pretty face, along with all my contact information. If you guys have questions after this is over, as Dan mentioned, I'm the general counsel for the County Chairs Association. So ultimately, I work for all of you. And so if you have questions, please feel free to give me a call, shoot me an email, and I will get back to you, and hopefully, help clarify whatever issue you've got, or point you in the right direction. Okay, so we're going to start with just kind of a general outline of what we're going to be talking about. And I like to break this up into two pieces. One is getting on the ballot, and one is staying on the ballot. For the overwhelming majority of counties, you will only deal with caucuses. There are some in the state based on population size. There are some counties and some townships within those counties that can have primaries, but we're not really going to be talking about that. We're going to be focusing on caucuses specifically. The other thing I'm going to point out is the timelines are different in this process if you are getting on the ballot as a major party candidate versus an independent or a new party candidate. If you do that, those timelines are a little different. So all we're focusing in on here is the caucus process for major political parties in Illinois. So that's really going to be the overwhelming majority, I think, of what we talk about. We will talk some about objections at the end, but the focus is really going to be on the caucus process overall. So, and this kind of goes to the point I made about focusing on major political parties. The note on the bottom is important. There is no option to run as a nonpartisan candidate. It is different if you run as an independent or a new party candidate. That is not the same thing. But when I've done these presentations with the Township Officials of Illinois, or the Township Supervisors of Illinois, I've gotten this question a lot about, I thought I was running as a nonpartisan candidate, which I understand is a common practice, that either a new party will be set up as a part of it, as a part of getting on the ballot for your township positions, or you will have people that run as independents. But you need to understand those are different than running as a nonpartisan candidate. The Attorney General has ruled that is not an option under the Township Code, and there's been no amendment to the Township Code to address this opinion since it was issued in April of 2000. So that's important to remember. Okay, so we're going to start with kind of the who, the when, and the where. And I'm going to apologize in advance because the election code is not the model of clarity. It is poorly written. It is difficult to understand. And I'm saying that as somebody who deals with it functionally every day. So there are a couple terms that I want you to keep in mind here. First off, focusing on these central committees, the Township Central Committee or the Multi-Township Central Committee. All that is basically a subcommittee of your county party. So for your county party, you are I'm here in Springfield, so the Sangamon County Democratic Party or the Richland County Democratic Party. Well, within each county that has townships, the subcommittee is just the precinct committee people who live within that township, who reside within that township, and who are elected as PCs within that township. So that's who comprises the Township Central Committee. Same thing for Brian, go ahead. You're muted.
Yeah. Now you can hear me. I just wanted to point out in what you just said is very true. And the central committee for a particular township, depending on the size of your township, could just be one person. It could just be a single PC in a very rural township, or it could be six or seven or a dozen. I know in my own township, we have seven. But it all depends on the size of your township. So when you're talking central committee, always remember it is just the precinct committee people, and it could just be one person.
That's a great point. I actually had this issue come up in a conversation on this earlier this year. The township was two PCs, and it was like that can't be right. And it's like, no, I promise that's right. It really can be that small. Um, and so, if it's kind of natural, I think, when you have a group that small for something like this, that something seems off or something doesn't seem right. But Brian is exactly right. It can be as small as one person. Okay, so we've kind of established the who here. Now let's focus on the when. And this is an example of what I meant when I said that the election code is poorly written, and you can tell it's written by lawyers because they use 10 words when two would do. The Township Caucus is held on the first Tuesday in December preceding the date of the township election. So the first Tuesday in December preceding, in this case, April 2025. And I looked at my calendar earlier. I believe that is December the 3rd. Yeah, it's December the 3rd. If you have a multi-township caucus, it is on the first Wednesday in December preceding the date of the multi-township election. So in that case, it would be Wednesday, December the 4th. And those dates are important to remember because everything in the election code kind of works backwards from those, as you'll see on what the timeline is for different notices that have to be sent and things like that.
Tony, if I might make a point there about you mentioned the multi-township.
Yes, sir.
Just for some clarification for folks that may not know, some of the rural counties are probably very much aware of it, but a multi-township assessing district is separate, is a separate government, is a separate caucus, and it is simply for the position of assessor.
Right.
In some rural areas, you have an assessor who is elected in maybe two, three, four, six, or seven townships. And that's what's called the multi-township.
Right. And that is where that comes up. So that's a great a great clarifier. So thank you, Brian. Um, for scheduling the caucus, the code requires that the caucus be held on the first Tuesday in December, so December 3rd, and it also states that it can't start any earlier than 6 p.m. And so naturally, especially, and this is an issue that comes up more so in rural counties, there's only so many places where you can hold a township caucus. Um, and so the natural issue that arises is what happens when both the Republicans and the Democrats want to hold their caucus at the township building at 6 p.m. on December the 3rd. And so if that occurs, the township clerk basically has to establish like a lottery system for whose caucus is going to be held where and at what time to avoid that conflict. And that really is the only instance where the the town clerk is involved in scheduling location, because generally it's up to the township caucus, or the township central committee to decide where they want to have the caucus at. And one thing I note down there at the very end of the slide is that accessibility is important. You can, in theory, run into an issue. I don't know that I've ever seen it happen, but you can run into an issue where if you pick a location that a particular candidate or a slate of candidates can't access for one reason or another, the door is locked or they're in a wheelchair and there's no ramp, as an example, you can run into issues there. So when you're picking a location, keep in mind that accessibility is really, really important.
Tony, we had a question come in from one of our county chairs on what do we do if there are no PCs in the precincts in a township? How does that get taken care of then?
So, and this actually is going to segue into a really important point that we're going to make a little further in the presentation. The short answer is that there's kind of two parts to the answer. The first is the chair of the county central committee can serve on the township central committee as like an ex officio member. And so, that is one thing kind of to remember generally as we go through this, but also because that kind of segues into, I think, how you fix this issue, which is, if nothing else, I would recommend, and I'm curious to see what Brian has to say to this, I would recommend appointing somebody, even if it's just one person. And the reason is that if there is no one, and as a result, no caucus is held, it creates pretty significant issues for the party down the road if you want to slate a candidate after the caucus date. And we'll get into this in a little more detail later, but the gist of it is, if there's not a caucus, there can't be a candidate. And that is really, really important to remember. Brian, I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on ways to address that?
Well, the only other way I think the county chair could correct it is appoint someone as county chair. He or she can appoint PCs in vacant positions. I do know that this happens a lot. You might have to get your list out to look to see who's a D in that particular township because you didn't have anyone run for PC, but see who pulled a ballot in the primary, and you could call and see if they'd be willing to be appointed. And I think, especially if someone's interested in running for office, they may be willing to serve as chair just to have a caucus.
Yeah, exactly. And to the point that Brian just raised about having a caucus and what I said earlier, you'll see down in bold and big letters and underlined, this is the why. This is the why there needs to be a caucus, even if it's just one person. And even if that person is, your candidate for supervisor or your candidate for one of the members of the board of trustees. If you do not have a caucus, you cannot slate candidates. You are barred from doing it. If no caucus is held, they can and likely will be objected to. And I can tell you that they'll win because
Right.
it is explicitly in the township code that that failure to hold a caucus bars that central committee from nominating any candidates in any way to serve in those positions.
And Tony, I might add that a lot of times, the November election is going to burn people out, and people are going to be so weary after the election, they're going to think, oh, here we go into another election cycle. And so they may not be tuned in, but you hold a caucus, and then maybe the next day you run into your neighbor who's you say, hey, I want you to run for trustee or for clerk. And they say, oh, yeah, I'd like to do that, but I didn't know anything about the caucus. Well, then they'd be able to slate them if they actually held the caucus. And I think it's just so important to stress, regardless of if you have no one show up at your caucus or you don't bring anyone, have a caucus so you can get someone slated if indeed you want to before the ballot certification.
Right. And Dan, I know that you're monitoring the chat, but I just saw a related question that I want to answer while we're on the topic. Can the county chair conduct the caucus if no PC is willing to be appointed? Um, here's um, the short answer to that is I'm not sure, because I don't know that that's ever been tried. I can tell you based on, and this is just how lawyers think generally, I look to case law to tell me what's okay and what isn't. Um, I know, as an example, that the county chair can serve as a member of that township central committee because there's case law where the Illinois courts say that that's okay. I don't know that I've ever seen an instance where the only person participating in the township caucus is somebody who doesn't live there. That's where you can run into problems. I can see arguments for and against it. But the short answer is I don't know. So please do everything you can from to avoid being the test, the test balloon. I can tell you it's never fun to be in that position. And so if you have a way to avoid it, please do. Okay, so the caucus process really kind of requires 3 notices to go back and forth between the clerk, the township central committee, and the very last one is with a newspaper. Okay, so 30 days before the caucus, the township clerk is required to notify the township central committee of their obligation to report the time and location of the caucus. So that's the first notice that goes. It goes from the town clerk to the township central committee. What I've seen just from experience is that most of these town clerks will not know who's affiliated with the township central committee. And so that notice generally, at least in my experience, has gone to the county party chair, who can then forward it on to, the relevant PCs within that township. So that has to come in. Then 10 days after that, so 20 days before the caucus, which is the deadline, the chair of the township central committee is required to notify the town clerk of the time and location for the caucus. One of the things I personally find kind of interesting is these only have to be sent by first class mail. So, in a lot of other instances, you'll see a requirement that it be certified, that it be registered, that somebody has to sign for it. And that doesn't have to happen here. So this is one of those things. I'm bringing all that up to say you really need to be on the lookout for this notice. Because again, if you don't comply with these requirements, you can't hold a caucus. And if you can't hold a caucus, you can't slate a candidate. So keep those in mind. 30 days out, you should be seeing a notice via first class mail from the township clerk. And then 20 days out, you do have to have it, stamped that day in order to be able to comply. So those are the 2 notices. And then we get to the notice by publication. And in this case, it's 10 days out, at least 10 days before the caucus. The town board has to publish notice of the time, or excuse me, the township central committee has to publish notice of the time and location for the caucus in a newspaper of general circulation. One of the issues I know a lot of more rural counties have is you may not have a newspaper that is published within your township or even necessarily within your county. And with that scenario, that's why I mentioned, of general circulation, it doesn't have to be one that is published in the county or in the township, although that would be preferred. If for some of my Southern Illinois friends, if the only newspaper of general circulation in your county is the Southern Illinoisan, then that's where you publish it. Unfortunately, those kind of regional papers are a little more expensive. But if that's the only option you have, that's the one that you do have to go with. And so those are kind of the three notices that have to go out in order for a caucus to take place. From
Tony,
there, you have
sorry, jump in here. If we have a township central committee that already knows where they're going to hold it and has all their information, can they notify the clerk before receiving the notice? Or do they have to wait? Is there a procedure they have to wait to receive the notice before sending in the information for their event or for the caucus?
so I don't know that they have to. I would recommend that they do, because the issue that can arise is, it is a requirement that that notice be sent. And so I could see a scenario where the argument is, well, you told me where it was back in October, and so I didn't send the notice. And that notice, I mean, you have to have proof that that notice was sent in order to be able to comply with these provisions. So if you know where it's going to be now, I'd say, reserve the room, get it locked up. But I would wait until you know that the notice has been sent, in order to, officially notify them. One thing kind of related to that, and I'll make a plug for the State Board of Elections here. They have a really good caucus guide that is available that includes links to model forms that you can use, that gives you some kind of pointers on, issues that they've seen come up through this process. And it really is, I think, a very good guide and a very helpful guide. So it is on their website. It is available. It's been updated for 2025. So, consult that, if for no other reason than to get the form for notification to the town clerk. Brian, do you have anything to add there? Okay. All right. Rules of procedure. So these are required by the township code. These are the rules that are required under the code itself. But you'll see that one of the rules is that the central committee can establish other rules that they think might be necessary, in order to make sure that the caucus goes smoothly. There are some limitations on what those rules can be. As an example, you can't require a filing fee. You can't have a rule that says if you want to run, it's going to be $10, or if you want to run, you've got to buy the pizza. But if there are specific rules about the amount of time you want people to speak, or if you've got competing slates, do you want one representative to speak on behalf of the slate and then the other, and how do you want to structure that? Those are the types of things that kind of fit into the other rules. So I'm not going to sit here and just read off all of these to you. As I mentioned, we're going to have a copy of this available for you so you can look through those. But one thing that I do want to point out, because I got this question more than I expected this year when I was doing these presentations, and that is, you cannot use a weighted vote in a caucus, which is kind of, it may seem a little counterintuitive because, for example, when you were elected chair of your county party, you may have had a weighted vote in that instance, but it does have to be one person, one vote. So it's really kind of the last best example we have of direct democracy, where everybody gets in the room, and whoever's got more people in the room wins. So yeah, those are the requirements under the township code. And you can see they're pretty comprehensive, but you do have this, what I'll call like a pressure release valve, basically, where if there are other rules that you need to establish in order to make things run smoothly, you can.
I might add, Tony, too.
Yes, sir.
The central committee, kind of a best practice, the township central committee should meet prior to holding the caucus. Doesn't matter how long ahead of time, but get it done, get those rules of procedure established. So no one can come back and say, well, I didn't know what was going to happen or how it was going to take place, because as you very much point out at the very bottom, those rules are approved by the attendees at the caucus. And if they, someone who wants to take over, so to speak, brings more people, they can vote down your rules and establish their own.
Right. Right. That's a great point. And yeah, I can tell you just about everybody that I've talked to who works in this kind of area of the law gives that exact same advice as what Brian mentioned. It really is best practice to get your PCs together, get this Township Central Committee together ahead of time, and kind of hammer out what rules you do want to have kind of offered to the caucus participants, so that it's fundamentally a fairness issue, but it's also a time management issue. I mean, I'm sure we've all sat through revisions to bylaws at one point or another, and what should have been a 30-minute meeting turns into a 3-hour meeting. So getting that done ahead of time, it really will kind of put you in the best position to, get through this process efficiently, and really focus on, what I would argue is the more important reason that you're there, which is to nominate your candidates. And to Brian's point specifically about the note at the bottom, you'll see that we use the phrase qualified caucus participants. And that begs the question, what is a qualified caucus participant? Thankfully, that's the next slide. So there are some participation requirements that basically every person who wants a vote, who wants a say, has to meet. So they have to be registered to vote within the township. They have to attest to their registration and their political affiliation. They cannot take part in the proceeding of more than one caucus during the same election. So as an example, I can't if the Republicans were holding their caucus at 6 and the Democrats are holding theirs at 6:30, I can't vote for the spoiler candidate at the Republican caucus at 6 and then vote for the candidate that I want to win at 6:30. You have to pick one. And this kind of ties into the objections that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. These affidavits can be used as evidence of political affiliation in that election process. And so, as an example, if you attend a Democratic Party caucus for a township, and then later on in the cycle, you sign a petition for your best friend, your drinking buddy, your brother, your cousin, whatever, but they're running for a different party. This affidavit can be used, if you can get access to it, this affidavit can be used to invalidate that signature on the petition. And that type of stuff happens all the time. So keep that in mind. And that's one of the many reasons why having people attest to their registration and their political affiliation is really important. And that kind of goes to the fourth point there. You can't then sign a petition of nomination for an independent or new party candidate for the same election for the same offices. So this is what's called a lockout or a knockout provision. And basically what it's designed to do is prevent, the township caucus devolves. There are 2 slates, your slate loses. And so then they want to run as a new party or an independent candidate. The fact that they participated in the caucus means that they cannot then run as new party candidates because they lost. but you also cannot sign a petition for them, or for anybody really. Your participation in the party caucus, kind of it locks you in to not playing the spoiler in other ways, for the election, for these offices and for other offices.
So
And
Tony,
Tony,
along the same lines with the participation, if you had somebody that voted in the Republican primary, this past primary in March, and then showed up to vote or for the Democratic caucus in December, or would they be allowed to participate in that caucus?
no,
I
it's a
agree.
12-month rule.
I agree. I think, but I guess the caveat that I would add is that the answer should be no. And that should be the uniform answer throughout the state. Unfortunately, you may have scenarios where, there are objections that are made either, to certain people participating who weren't qualified to do so, or vice versa, objections to nomination petitions later, that the local electoral board may choose, even though they shouldn't, they may choose not to really strictly enforce that rule. But the answer should be no, and it should be no everywhere in the state. Unfortunately, what should be and what happens are not necessarily always the same thing.
Right. And something else I would point out, and I can give you a good example. You talk about you cannot participate in a caucus and then turn around and run as an independent. Well, I know a gentleman for a fact over in Piatt County several years ago. He was not going to go to his caucus because there was going to be a fight if the other person had enough people. So they both candidates stood outside the door and counted noses as people went in. This guy realized he didn't have enough votes to win at the caucus, so the other guy went in. He did not. Then this guy was able to turn around and run as an independent, which he did, and beat the guy then who was nominated at the caucus.
This is one of the things I love about this area of the law, is that there are stories of really creative people doing stuff like that.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, that type of scenario, that's allowable. But I would argue as soon as you walk in the door, you've kind of crossed the threshold, you've crossed the Rubicon, and you can't cross back.
Right. And, people sign an affidavit when they go into that caucus stating that they are affiliated with that party holding the caucus. And it's very clear on that affidavit, at least the one that's put out by the State Board of Elections, that, they did not vote in the opposite party's primary. So if you're attending a Democrat caucus back in March, you didn't vote in the Republican primary, and you're not an elected official of the other party, and so forth. So it's very it can cause some issues, but the central committee has the power to say, hey, we've got this list, you're not eligible to attend the caucus.
Yep. Okay. Couple last things to remember. The first is that petitions are not required. I've actually talked to a couple township supervisors who, their idea was basically, we're going to implement petitions as a way of controlling the kind of keeping, the what's the word I'm looking for? Some of the more fringe candidates. We want people that can show some sort of kind of minimal appeal to the people in the room. You can't do that. I think I mentioned this earlier too. You can't do a filing fee. It can't be that whoever wants to run for supervisor has to buy pizza, and whoever wants to run for clerk has to buy beer. It can't be any kind of monetary or filing fee in the form of goods or something like that. As Brian and I both have mentioned, State Board of Elections has some great resources. They have suggested forms. Use them. I can tell you I've been in more electoral board hearings than I care to count, where it's just accepted as gospel that if you used the State Board of Elections form, you complied with the law. There are times when I have to argue against that, but that is the level of deference that is shown to the State Board of Elections. So they have the resources there, use them. And the last is that the township ultimately pays for the caucus. One important caveat here, they pay for things like room rental, publication, mailing, things like that. I know I said a moment ago that you can't force the supervisor to buy pizza. Well, you can't force the township to do it either. They have to pay in order for they have to pay for the things that allow you to go to a place and cast your vote. And that's it.
Right. And Tony, I would agree. A couple of things I want to mention on the paying part, that could include like rental, if you have to rent a large room because you anticipate a large crowd. It could be for printing, if you have to print ballots, because you're going to have a contest for one of the offices. You just want to be careful with, because it is tax dollars that's paying for it. I'll give you a funny story. Several years ago, back in Southern Illinois, there was a township down there. They had large caucuses. They had maybe 450 people at this caucus. They held it at the high school gym. And after the caucus, they turned in their bills to the township. And I had one of the township trustees call me and said, these bills, they've got rental and so forth is legitimate, but said they've got $100. They paid a woman to sing the national anthem. And he said, I just don't think that's appropriate. So, that's stretching it a little bit too much. The other point I wanted to make was you talked about no filing fees are required. When the Central Committee sets up the procedures for the caucus, they can require a written notice of intent to be a candidate to be filed with them. So that kind of helps if you're anticipating a fight, so to speak, in your caucus.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up, Ryan, because that's a really important distinction. You can require that someone, sign a notice of intent where it's just them, it's them filling the form out and signing their name to it. It's when you require them to go get signatures from somebody else, or another group of people in order to get on the ballot. That's where it becomes problematic. So just kind of use that as your rule of thumb, so to speak. Okay. So you go through the caucus process. What happens afterwards? The Central Committee has to canvass and declare the results. And then the chair of the Central Committee files a certificate of nomination by caucus that lists all of the candidates nominated for township office at that caucus. It has to be filed between 113 and 106 days prior to the election. This is another great example of the election code making things really simple for everybody, because you have to go and calculate that. This is where I'm going to give a plug to the State Board of Elections again, because as a part of this, I do have a kind of a tentative timeline. They have a timeline in their caucus guide as well, that lays out all of these dates and has corresponding links to forms. So the certificate of nomination is filed, and then the local election official then decides which party is listed first on the ballot. And this is an important distinction because I've seen people kind of get these confused. The local election official is, in most of your counties, I would assume, the county clerk or if your township is governed by a board of election commissioners, it's those. So that's different, and that's not the same place that the certificate of nomination by caucus has to be filed. The certificate of nomination by caucus is filed with your town clerk.
Tony, if I may interject here, it has always been my understanding that the local election official is the township clerk. The election authority official is the county clerk. So it has always been my understanding, and according to statute, that it is the township clerk that does this ballot placement lottery.
Yeah. Was that not what I said? Oh, okay. I must have confused the two. I'm sorry. See, it's a confusing thing. The names vary some. What I meant to say, and I apologize if I said it differently, is that the election official, the ballot, okay. The certificate of nomination is filed with the township clerk. That's where the ballot placement lottery occurs, and then the certification of the ballot is done with the election authority.
Correct.
Right. I apologize. I told you it's easy to get confused on these, as evidenced by the fact that I just did it. Okay. Now, the certificate of nomination is actually more than one document. There is the certificate itself. There has to be a statement of candidacy. The loyalty oath can be included. Does not have to be, but it can be. And the statement of economic interest has to be filed. You have to have a receipt from that as well as a part of the certificate of nomination by caucus. Those documents, as I mentioned, are filed with the town clerk or the appropriate board of election commissioners. And for multi-township central committees, so for those the multi-township assessment districts, like what Brian mentioned earlier, those are typically filed with the county clerk. Or, if there is a board of election commissioners that oversees that entire district, those are filed with them. But generally, it's going to be your county clerk. And the certificate of nomination has to be signed by both the chair and the secretary of the caucus, both of whom have to include their residence addresses. For an assessor, as if it wasn't complicated enough, you have the additional requirement that they file proof of their qualifications to serve as assessor. There's a specific certification that you have to get in order to serve as an assessor, in order to be an assessor. And if you do not have that certification, you cannot, I guess in theory, you could wind up on the ballot. You can never serve because you don't have the certification.
Tony, what I always recommended folks to do, assessors should file proof of their qualifications with their party, with the township, to make sure everybody is on the same page. They know they are. I mean, there's no use of going to the caucus if you're not qualified to run. There's no use to be nominated because you can't serve.
Right.
So they need to show that proof to the township, to the central committee, that they are willing or that they are qualified to serve, and then they can proceed.
Right. And kind of going back to the point, just to kind of tie this back in of the additional rules, I think you'd be perfectly okay as an example, if you had an assessor that's on the ballot and you wanted to make one of the rules that, that has to be included, or you have to bring it with you to the caucus, the proof of your qualifications. I think that's a perfectly acceptable rule to have. And it addresses the concern that Brian's pointing out, which is you don't want to nominate somebody who can't do the job.
Right.
Okay. We're going to kind of switch gears here for just a second, and focus on what has to be given to the candidates once they file. I'm sure that as chairs, you have all seen this or gotten one at some point when you've run for office, and that's what's called your notice of obligation to comply with the Illinois Campaign Financing Act. Those are required under state law to be provided to every candidate at the time that they file their nomination papers. If that person's not there, because I know as an example in Sangamon, we'll have one person that walks over, a stack of nomination papers, then it must be sent to that candidate within 2 business days. And it must specifically mention, we kind of to the note down at the bottom, that the forms for these statements that are required to be filed under the election code are available, from the State Board of Elections or the county clerk. There's a form notice that the State Board of Elections uses. In my experience, most people rely on that form, just as a way of not reinventing the wheel. So, kind of use that and rely on that, and that will work for you. Okay, so here's kind of your tentative timeline. I do have a couple more things that I want to kind of hit before we run out of time here. So I'm just going to kind of leave this up for you to look at really quickly, because I do want to talk about objections a little bit. Okay, I like to joke that this was me when I had hair in this next one. So objections. There are some filing requirements for objections. The objections must be filed within 5 business days after the close of the filing period. So for certificates of nomination, those will close on a Monday. You then have until the following Monday to file objections. They must be filed in the same location that the certification was filed. The objector must be a legal voter of the township, and they must be filed in triplicate. For whatever reason, the election code hasn't caught up to the 21st century. So you are required to submit an original and 2 copies. And over here on the kind of right side, my right, is an example of a form where I actually represented the objector, and we were objecting to a township supervisor's certificate of nomination, because this particular supervisor was under the impression that you could notarize your own signature. That was the basis for the objection. So I kind of use it as an example as we go along here. The objections are required to say certain things. For example, it has to include the objector's name and residence address. It has to state fully the nature of the objection. It has to state what interest the objector has in the objection. And it has to state what relief is requested from the electoral board. So using the example that I've got here, the objector's name and address, we listed out their name, where they reside, what township and county, and then you see the interest, and you'll see this language if you're around objections for any period of time. This is kind of boilerplate language. There's a company here in Springfield called the Illinois Institute for Continuing Legal Education. They have a kind of a whole course specifically on local government elections, and this is, this language gets used within their forms, so you will see it all over the place. And the reason is because, kind of going back to what I said at the beginning, lawyers like things that have been tested by the courts, and this language has been tested by the courts. And it's been approved as sufficient to comply with the election code. So all you have to say is that you are a citizen desirous of seeing to it that the laws governing the filing of nomination papers for a candidate for nomination and election to the office of blank are properly complied with, and that only qualified candidates have their name appear upon the ballot as candidates for said office. One of the recurring themes here, lawyers like to say in 20 words what you could say in 5. Basically what you're saying there with that long sentence is, I think that candidates should follow the law, and that's my interest. And that is sufficient. So it's not, you don't have to use these magic words, but there is a reason that you will see these words kind of over and over. You have to explain what the basis for your objection is. And I've got that highlighted there on the left. That, this guy notarized his own signature on his statement of candidacy, which you just can't do. And the relief that we requested was a hearing, an examination by the board of the records related to that of the township records as they relate to this election, a ruling that the nomination papers are insufficient, and that this candidate be left off the ballot. Once an objection is received, you have to note the day and the hour that it was filed, and that's what you can see up here on the objection that I'm using as the example. The town clerk wrote that in and on when she received it. The clerk then has to mail objection and a copy of the objection and nomination papers out no later than noon on the second business day after receiving the objection. And I pointed out that it was first class mail last time, so I'll point it out here. It's either by registered mail or personal service for this. And they have to be sent to the candidate and the chair of the electoral board. They also have to include what's called a call of the electoral board. This doesn't have to be sent at the same time, but it does have to come within 24 hours. The chair of the electoral board issues the call to the objector and the candidate. It also must be sent by registered mail or personal service. And here's the example of the call that we received in this case. It doesn't have to be really fancy. It just has to lay out, here's what basically here's what we're going to be doing, and here's what our obligations are. And here are the, what the requirements are for the content of these. It's required to meet. You have to designate who the members are, the date, the time, and the place where the meeting's going to take place. And the date of the meeting has to happen really quickly. In objections, everything moves very, very, very quickly. So who's on the electoral board? So the supervisor is the chair. The clerk is a member, and the longest continually serving trustee is the third member. If for any reason a member of the electoral board is involved in the objection, either as an objector or the candidate, then that person comes off and you go to the next longest serving trustee and just kind of work your way down. Then the meeting of the electoral board takes place. The first meeting, you're required to adopt rules, and you can set up, typically they'll set up a type of briefing schedule where you can kind of lay out in writing what your argument is. And then they will, kind of build that schedule out and leave you to it. It's a very truncated schedule. It's a very short schedule. It's entirely possible that you have 24 to 48 hours to draft a brief, which may not sound like much, or, that may not sound like it's that big of a deal, but, for lawyers, moving quickly is like 21 days. So, if you have to do something within 2, it's like rocket speed. And then ultimately the electoral board's task is to consider whether the papers are in proper form and whether or not they comply with the law. And that's that cite to section 1010 down there at the bottom of the page. And I think people get confused at times because they'll want to argue about things other than whether the form of the paper, be it a certificate of nomination or a petition, they want to argue about things other than, is it in proper form, and was the time and the conditions imposed by the law, were those complied with? Those are the only two things that you need to argue about in an objection. After all of that takes place, the electoral board has to issue a written decision. It has to be in writing. It has to specifically state which objections were sustained. It has to be served during an open meeting, unless one of those parties refuses to show up for that meeting, in which case it will be deemed served upon mailing. And so here is the final decision that we got in that case that I've been citing to. We won. There's kind of a quirk that comes up after the fact, but at the electoral board, we did win on this objection. From there, the loser has kind of a couple options. Either you can take the decision of the electoral board and stop there, or you can seek judicial review. That means you go to court and you have a real judge, not Judge Steve Harvey, give you a ruling on it. That has to be done within 5 days of being served with the decision. It has to be served on the electoral board and all of the parties that participated before the electoral board. And then the electoral board has to file the record of what took place as its answer. Once that all takes place, the court is then required to set this for hearing within 30 days, which again, for when comparing it to, normal court cases is just rocket speed. Here are some of the more common objections that you see. And I'm going to point out a couple of these. The first is missing page numbers. This comes up obviously more in nomination petitions than it does in certificates for nomination. But this one is one that seems like, okay, it's just kind of ticky-tack, but it's fatal. If there are missing page numbers, that is one of the things that really consistently you can get people knocked off the ballot for. And it's one of those things that doesn't seem like it should be as fatal as it is, but it is. No statement of economic interest. That's another one. Incorrect election information. Some people will list primaries or they'll list the wrong year. We're going to be in 2025 here. They'll list 2027 or 2023 or whatever. That can be enough to get you knocked off the ballot. If documents aren't properly notarized, like for example, if you notarize them yourself, that can get you kicked off the ballot. And residency is another big one because that is kind of one of the more tricky examples here. And the case I like to point to is the one from Chicago when Rahm Emanuel ran for mayor. He hadn't lived in Chicago for like years. But ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that he was a resident of Chicago that whole time because he always intended to come back. So it's not just as simple as, where do you keep your socks at night? It really is more nuanced, and there are a lot of factors that courts can consider. And so it is possible that, you cannot live within the jurisdiction for a couple of years and then come back and run. The inverse is also possible, that you can live within the jurisdiction, but you're not a resident. That is much less common, but of an objection, but it is possible. Okay, that's everything. Brian, do you have anything any last words of wisdom for us?
I think, just a couple things. First of all, this is an important process for local government and for the Democratic Party. We're all Democrats here on this call, mostly county and township chairs. it's important if we're going to build the party, I feel that we get people engaged and involved in this caucus process, and they're going to be leaders in our community, and we want to get more Democrats in those roles. So even though it falls right in the midst of all this November election stuff, please take your time with your central committee and do what you need to do to get a caucus held, and above all, hold a caucus regardless. If you end up with no candidates or you have a full slate, make sure you have a caucus so that in case you want to fill a vacancy, you can do that before the ballot's certified. That's all I had.
I don't have anything to add.
Thank you, Tony and Chair Smith. Thank you for joining us. I know I took a lot of notes for tonight on the township chair for my township, so I'm planning on getting our township up and going here as soon as the November election's done. To wrap up, thank you everyone for attending this evening. We did record tonight, so we will have that available with the Democratic Party of Illinois. And the training deck will make sure that that gets shared with everyone as well. If you have any questions on anything tonight, most of you should have my contact information from when you signed up through Mobilize. If not, I'm going to drop my email in the chat. Please feel free to reach out and I can get your questions moved along to either of our presenters and make sure that they can follow up directly with you. So if I'll leave the chat open for a couple extra seconds. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and jump in there. If not, thank you for joining us and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.